welcome Greg Grandin, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, and Peter V. and C. Van Woodward, professor at Yale. His acclaimed works include The End of the Myth, Empire's Workshop, Kissinger's Shadow, The Empire of Necessity, and Fordlandia.
Then the Depression hits, 1929. Roosevelt's elected in 32. He's inaugurated in 33, March 33. He has a series of failed international conferences in Europe that doesn't achieve any kind of sense that there was hope for stability. But there is this other conference on the horizon, and that's in Montevideo, where Pepe Mujica was, would he have been born in 1933 no. When would he have been born if he was 89? 35, okay. Okay, so 1933 was the conference. Mujica would have been born within 2 years. So there's this Pan-American conference scheduled. And Roosevelt wants Cordell Hull, his Secretary of State, to go down and deal with the Latin Americans. And Roosevelt, when he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he was a pretty big imperialist. He claimed to have written Haiti's constitution. He tried to buy a bunch of land in Haiti. In that constitution, it forced Haiti to allow foreigners to buy land. I mean, Roosevelt had a reputation of being a little bit of a brash of an imperialist up until he became, I guess, a politician and a reformer. But he sends Cordell Hull and he says, look, give them whatever they want, give them lights so they can land planes at night, but don't make any changes to international law and don't agree for us to give up the right of intervention. But this is 1933 and politics are a lot looser then, and Hull's his delegation is it's made up by lawyers and State Department men who are making sure that Hull is saying the right thing. But he also brings Ernest Gruning, who is an editor at The Nation and a committed anti-imperialist. People might know Gruning as a senator from Alaska who cast a vote against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. But then he had written constantly on Haiti, and he had 4 sisters, and they were all part of the radical New York Jewish left that was active and allies with the NAACP and W.E. Du Bois, and they were writing about racism and the Klan at home, and Gruning was writing about Mexico and Haiti, and he writes to Felix Frankfurter, his friend, and he says, I'd really like to go on this delegation. Do you think you can ask I don't know what they would call Franklin, I guess, if there's a spot for me. And Roosevelt agrees. I mean, it would be like sending Amy. It would be like as if they sent Amy down to, if Trump and, who's that guy that they got negotiating Gaza? What's the name? What?
Wickoff?
Yeah, Wickoff. It's like Wickoff and brought in, to go negotiate with Iran. And Gruning's, and of course they're traveling by ocean liner, so they have a lot of time, and Gruning basically lectures Hull about Latin American history. And there's a weird confluence that happens. Hull is from Tennessee, and in his mind, he equates Reconstruction and the occupation of the North and the imposition of the North with the United States. I mean, we like Reconstruction, we don't like U.S. intervention in Latin America. He saw it, in his mind, he saw them as kind of equivalent, right? Like the arrogance of Northerners imposing their will on Southerners. And he was also a free trader. He was on the right side of the New Deal. And in his mind, he also came to see an equation between free trade and non-intervention. So by the time he gets to Buenos Aires, by the time he gets to Montevideo, he completely capitulates to every one of Latin America's demand. And he is hailed as an unconquering hero. He basically gives up the right to conquest, the right to intervention, and he recognized the absolute sovereignty in the internal and external affairs of all nations, no matter what their size. And he's having such a good time, he doesn't want to leave. He's drinking. His prohibition isn't quite over in the United States, but he says the first thing he's going to do is he's going to lower tariffs on Latin American rum, and that's what he does. So he makes it back to the United States, and it turns out, and of course Roosevelt quickly figures out that this is gold. It's gold. It's gold, Jerry. It's gold, and he obtains for Hull the power to negotiate reciprocal tariff treaties with individual nations. And so he signs about 6 or 7 treaties right away with Latin American nations that lower tariffs. It's like we're living in an upside down world, right? We're living in the bad neighbor policy, the good neighbor policy. And that creates, at this time, the New Deal was kind of under siege. The first kind of reformist period had exhausted itself. The right was mobilizing. The right was mobilizing in these kind of Liberty League, kind of quasi-fascist Saxon paramilitary organizations. And there was a lot of labor violence, strong reaction against labor reform laws. A lot of the economic elites who supported Roosevelt in '32 broke with him. But Hull wins them back because of these treaties with Latin America. And at the same time, we know the good neighbor policy as a kind of catchphrase that every politician talks about in Latin America, and we know about it. Roosevelt used it to talk about Latin America. What we know less about it was also the phrase that was used to talk about FDR's domestic get out the vote campaign. His campaign created good neighbor leagues. And these good neighbor leagues were used as a way to counter the Liberty Leagues, to put forward a kind of new ethics of social citizenship and a new cultural pluralism or tolerance. So the good neighbor leagues would organize Latinos in New Mexico and Native Americans in Arizona and Jews in New York and African Americans in the South and in Chicago. And they became like the main, Roosevelt said he liked the word so much he wanted to patent it, the good neighbor leagues. So these good neighbor league, and of course, the argument in the book is that Roosevelt, because of Hull's actions, and largely because of he listened to a radical journalist, created the possibility not only of beating back fascism or extremism in the United States, but Roosevelt won that election, that 1936 election, with 27 million votes, more votes than any other human being ever won in world history, and he ran it on largely a social democratic platform. And it was remarkable. He just ran the table in this unlikely coalition of non-intervention, free trade, this new kind of corporate bloc that didn't mind Roosevelt's domestic reform as long as he continued to promise to open up markets. And there's this expanding voting coalition a diverse, expanding voting coalition. And what's the first thing that he does after he wins? Can anybody guess what the first thing Roosevelt does? Like a week after he wins this historic election. Somebody take a guess. What? No, he goes to Buenos Aires. He takes a victory lap, but in Latin America. And he begins to shore up an anti-fascist continental coalition. And so the book talks about that and how that, so there was fear among strategists that Latin America, Mexico, Latin America could go the way of Spain, right? A lot of the socioeconomic indicators that led to the nationalist revolt in Spain were present in Latin America. And there was a fear that they could lose Latin America to right-wing nationalists and who would ally with Hitler and Mussolini. and the fact that Roosevelt effectively extended the New Deal, but not just because there was also domestic sources of social reform in Latin America, many of them, and I'm not, by no means am I arguing that it all comes from the United States, but Roosevelt, by legitimating, by tipping the table in their favor, tipped the favor away from the fascists and towards the Democrats, and basically secured Latin America as this anti-fascist redoubt that becomes, Russia won the war. We all know Russia won the war, but beat Germany, at least in the European theater. But Latin America was pretty crucial. The United States didn't have to fight one war of resources because of Latin America. That bit in Brazil that bulges out becomes a kind of becomes a key transit point in which they bring nonstop, cargo planes are flying nonstop into Northern Africa, bringing men and material into the European theater and North African theater. But then also Latin America itself, the goodwill of Pan-Americanism becomes the symbol of what Roosevelt repeatedly says we want the world to be once the war is over. If you want to know what we want after the post-war, look to Latin America. Roosevelt says it, Truman said it, Wilson said it earlier during World War I. But so that's kind of in some ways the core of the book.
Talk about the killing of Jorge Eliezer Gaetan.
Well, I have to explain who he is first. So this brings us to Colombia. Now, of course, this goodwill doesn't last. Anybody who knows anything about Latin America knows that that's not the end of the story. The United States does not continue to support social democrats in Latin America after FDR's death, and even earlier after Henry Wallace is booted off the ticket. But Henry Wallace plays a big part. He's another character, the U.S. during World War II invested an enormous amount of repressive capacity in the security forces of Latin America in the fight against fascism. As the United States turns from fighting fascism to fighting the left or fighting communism, so too do these security forces. And so there's an enormous amount of hope in Latin America, right? Latin Americans thought they were fighting not just against fascism, but for social democracy. And in 1945, nearly every Latin American country was some kind of social democracy. And there was, in its most jubilant kind of raucous sense, strikes, protests, people on the street expanding the franchise, expanding social spending. And, in 1945, I think only 3 or 4 Latin American countries were social democratic. Within 2 years, only 3 or 4 of those democracies were left, right? The tide turned quickly under Truman, and with the shift of the United States from supporting the left against the right to supporting the right against the left. And I tell the story of Jorge Gaetan to kind of capture this. Jorge Gaetan, this is a story particular to Colombia. And I wanted to tell this story because Colombia is confusing, and it doesn't often fit in the narratives that we tell about Latin America, or not easily. There's a lot of things that go on in Colombia. And it kind of is like, so I thought, for myself, I wanted to include Colombia to get a handle on it. Gaetan was a fascinating figure. He was a liberal. Colombia had 2 main parties that still use the words liberal and conservative. During the 1930s, the liberals became increasingly social liberal, if not socialist, at least the rank and file or the left wing of it. And the conservatives have become increasingly fascist or phalangist during the 1930s and 1940s. And Gaetan had enormous support. He was expected to win the 1950 election. He had built his support arguing and advocating as a lawyer for rural peasants in the countryside that was subject to paramilitary violence by landlords and conservative paramilitaries. He famously, the massacre that happens at the end of 100 Years of Solitude, that's based on a real event that happened in 1928, a real massacre. Gaetan became a kind of advocate for those banana workers. He gave these filibuster speeches. He took advantage of the new forms of radio, and he spoke in a kind of new style, in a kind of populist style, not the stilted formalism of Spanish legalism, vosotros. He spoke like la gente, and people responded, and he was enormously popular. So in April 1948, everything comes together. In April 1948. George Marshall is arriving to help found the Organization of American States, which in the United States' new geopolitical vision is going to be a key institution within the kind of national security framework and the Cold War. And so Pan-Americanism was transforming into the Organization of American States. Radical students who already sensed that the United States had shifted its policy and they began protesting, showed up. They were paid for by Betancourt in Venezuela and Perón in Argentina to protest the United States. Among them, Fidel Castro, who was a young lawyer. Gabriel Garcia Marquez was in Bogota because he was studying law and he lived in a pension. Camilo Torres, who was a Colombian, who was a famous a precursor to liberation theology, was in seminary, in Dominican seminary, and he was there. The Somoza family was there, a whole bunch of U.S. attachés, meaning the new kind of CIA that was just established in 1947 was there. And Gaitan, the conference had started. It was supposed to be a month-long event, and it was a month-long event. But and also, what was interesting is Latin Americans were demanding a Marshall Plan. They wanted their own Marshall. This is a big deal. They expected for their sacrifice during the war that there would be free and public capital and credit and investment in which to develop and move away from extractive industries. They wanted what Europe was getting, and they felt like they deserved it. Marshall shows up, he gives a couple of speeches. There's not going to be any Marshall Plan. You have to attract private capital. You have to attract private capital and private investment. And the effect of this, of course, is that by attracting, what do you have to do to attract private capital? You have to pacify your labor forces, what you have to do. Europe didn't have to do that, and therefore you could have social democracies and Christian democracies taking form, reformers that were anti-Soviet but still managing to build a welfare state. In Latin America, there was no room for that middle ground because there was no Marshall Plan. So George Marshall goes and he gives a couple of speeches. One he gives on April 7th, that there's not going to be a Marshall Plan. You have to, and lectures Latin America about, and they haven't even gotten to the security protocols yet that he wanted Latin America to sign on. April 8th at 1:09, Jorge Gaitan leaves his law office, and he's going to lunch with a group of people, and a man named Roaseta comes up behind him and shoots him 3 times in the back and kills him. And Bogota explodes. It's called the Bogotazo. Gaitan, Roaseta is dragged into a drugstore. He's kept alive, but the crowd pulls him out and beats him to death. The boot blacks beat him to death with their shine boxes. It's like a scene from Goodfellas or something. Fidel Castro, as a young student, he actually had an appointment with Gaitan later that afternoon. He grabs a rifle from a police station, he jumps up on a bench and he tries to organize, and he says, "Nobody listen to me." And he takes this as a big lesson battle, and then you had to build a political organization before you could have a revolution. And this is in 1948. And Colombia, Bogota just is devastated. Somebody said it was worse than London during the Blitz, one of the US generals. And Marshall had the good sense to continue to hunker down, gather the delegates in a bunker and continue and basically get them all to sign on to a number of protocols that had to do with anti-communism and policing communism and security protocols. And they also stopped complaining about not having a Marshall Plan. And this went on the riot went on for a week before Bogota was pacified, and then of course it gave way to decades of warfare in the countryside, which we don't have time to talk about. But I will say that the thing about Gaitan's death is that Colombians are obsessed about it the way U.S. is obsessed about JFK, and for much the same reason. It's almost as if, like, there's so many theories about who killed him. Rosado was deemed to be mentally unstable, somebody who was obsessed with the occult, with conspiracism, which he may have picked up at the German embassy, because there's this weird connection between fascism and mysticism and occultism, and it's my sense is that he was killed by conservative paramilitaries that were linked to one particular death squad, but that didn't really come out. The Scotland Yard sent people to investigate, the U.S. FBI investigated, Colombia investigated. It was never decided, never clear who was behind or what the motive was. It was deemed that he was mentally unstable. So there's, so this is like one of these killings that like JFK, it's kind of, for Colombians, it's, Mario Vargas Llosa has that great line from one of his novels, Peruvians want to know when exactly their country fucked up. And you could say the same thing about Colombia, and they have an exact date, 1:09 the afternoon on April 8th. And it's this sense of a leader that, was killed under mysterious circumstances, that had he lived, the country would have been a better place. That is Gaitan in many ways for Colombians. He's still a subject of novels and playwrights. So I take that, the reason why I take that and use that is because it compresses so much of the Cold War, that moment. And then I kind of trace out liberation theology through Camilo Torres and kind of heterodox economic critique through Raul Prebisch, and George Kennan, who right after the Bogotazo wrote a memo talking about how the United States had to mobilize a permanent psychological global war, and be on guard, and that in some ways was a direct result of Bogotazo. And I talk about that in Latin America, and I talk about, as I mentioned, I think liberation theology through Camilo Torres, and I trace out the post-war history.
I'm intrigued how Mexico was able to get away by nationalizing the oil industry. It must have been under FDR.
Yeah, I deal with this so for those who don't know, Mexico, this is going to be, I'll try not to make this a long answer like Gaitan, but Mexico was the United States' first nation-building project after the Civil War. U.S. capital, and the United States turned Mexico into an exporting nation governed by a heavy hand. And the Mexican Revolution in 1910 was basically the first third world revolution against capitalism and its justifying, enabling mythologies. And it passed a constitution in 1917 that was a liberal constitution in the sense that it had all of the liberal rights of restraining a state and allowing individuals the greatest room for freedom, but it was also the world's first social democratic constitution. And it guaranteed education and healthcare and the right to join a labor union, but it also said that private property is a privilege granted by the state, and the state owned all subsoil resources. This provision, was like an alarm bell in the night for the people who resided over the North American economy, because it basically presumed that private property was not an inherent untouchable right, and it was the basis of Mexico's radical land reform, which really took place in the 1930s under Cardenas, President under Cardenas, and oil nationalization, which was also the 1930s. And basically, the short answer is the United States had to accept it because of the Depression, because of World War, because of rising tensions in Europe, and because Roosevelt kept siding with his ambassador, and his ambassador in Mexico, Josephius Daniels, who in the United States was a Cold Stone racist. I don't know, involved in the Wilmington massacre in 1898. He goes to Mexico and he has like a come to Jesus moment where he all of a sudden becomes this radical and starts supporting all of these reforms and against Cordell Hull. He's constantly arguing with Cordell Hull. Hull wants Mexico to compensate. Mexico doesn't have the money to compensate for all of these expropriations. But FDR constantly sides with Daniels and Cardenas against Hull. So, but basically, it's FDR. It's FDR that is wisdom that what was needed was to socialize U.S. capital, not necessarily continue to serve as U.S. capital's agent abroad. And that was the main reason. The threat of fascism.